Welcome to panel session 3, The Labor Paradox, Navigating the Complexities of College Athlete Unionization. Kelsey Nicole Nelson, our moderator. She is an award-winning DC-based sports journalist, educator, and multi-business owner. She currently serves as a host and reporter for Fox Sports Radio, studio host for the Atlantic 10 Conference, and a color analyst for American University women's basketball team. To her left, we have Congressman Michael Baumgartner, United States Representative from the 5th District of Washington, my state. Representative Baumgartner has distinguished his tenure in Congress by prioritizing structural reform and cross-aisle collaboration in college sports. In Congressman Baumgartner's first year in Congress, he introduced the Restore College Sports Act, the Protect Student Athletes Act, and Correcting Opportunity and Accountability in College Hiring Act, the Coach Act, and the Protect Act. You've been busy in your short term so far. To his left, we have Frank Hawkins, attorney, Schumacher, Loop, and Kendrick. He's a nationally recognized sports executive with over 30 years' experience. Hawkins' career is highlighted by 15 years in senior leadership at the NFL, where he served as Senior Vice President of Business Affairs. To Frank's left is Professor Dionne Koller. Koller is a prominent sports law scholar and director of the Center for Sport and Law at the University of Baltimore School of Law. Her expertise spans youth, Olympic, Paralympic, and education-based sports, making her a sought-after consultant for state and federal legislatures. Notably, Koller was appointed by Senator Maria Cantwell to co-chair the Bipartisan Commission on the State of U.S. Olympic and Paralympics, delivering its final report to Congress in 2024. To her left is Michele Roberts. Michele served as the executive director of the National Basketball Players Association, the NPPA, from 2014 until her retirement in January of 2022. In this groundbreaking role as the first woman to lead a professional sports union in North America, she advocated for the rights and fair compensation of professional basketball players. The floor is all yours, Ms. Nelson.
Not how we want it started. But good afternoon, everyone. We are so excited to be here with you today. Thank you so much for sitting through the first 2 amazing panels where we got to hear from student athletes and touch on women's sports. And now we're going to take a deep dive into the potential unionization of collegiate sports, which, yeah, maybe not so contentious, but no, very contentious issue that's being talked about a lot in the news. So very excited to lead this panel with some very esteemed panelists sitting next to me. And I know we have a heavy job as we get you all after lunch, so please bear with us, but it's going to be a really great conversation. And so to kind of kick us off, I wanted to ask the first question. As we think about this topic of unionization of collegiate sports, what are some of the common misconceptions that you all hear, that you're reading in the news, centering around the conversation as it relates to the possible unionization of collegiate sports? And I'll let anyone kick us off. We'll start with Michele.
I was hoping it was my turn. Hi, let me disclaimer first. I am not, unlike the sister to my right, an expert in college athletes and in college sports. As has already been mentioned, to the extent I have any involvement in sports, it's been at the professional level. So I say that because there are some things that you might find offensive, or at least inconsistent with the philosophy of what is being done at the college level. Forgive me, I don't have that background, okay? Having said that, when I speak with people about the notion of a union and college athletes, what I hear most often is this notion that you, quote unquote, you can't possibly have a single union that's going to encompass the entire universe of athletes at the college level. And what I say to them is, you're absolutely right. And no one with any sense thinks that that's the next move, that that's the way you unionize college athletes. Not at all. I mean, take a look at the professional world. There is no single union for football players or basketball players or hockey players, right? Every single sport has its own players association, and they are segregated by gender. And so when I think about, and when people complain, well, this is impossible because colleges and the way the sports exist on the college level aren't conducive to a union organizing model, I tell them, no, it's going to be tough because, frankly, I'm still trying to figure out the NCAA and all these conferences. Having said that, there is a way to do it, and if professional sports could do it, with scholars like this sister to my right, y'all can do it too. So I push back heavily on the notion that there's simply too many different people and too many bodies to allow for organizing. That's just not true.
And any other panelists want to touch on any of the common misconceptions that you hear as it relates to this issue that you'd love to clear up here in front of this room?
I think that the most common misconception is one that I've heard from some of the athletic directors that I've been working with in some of the Western states with Republican legislators. They're saying, we have been told collective bargaining, no, all about Democrats. Not at all. This is about creating a sustainable system where it's not only rules being dictated by somebody from afar, but it's the student athletes themselves, notably those student athletes we heard from this morning and all their peers, saying what their concerns are, how it's going to make their college experience better if you do it way X instead of way Y. It's not about politics at all. It's about creating a sustainable system. And I really hope that over the next few months, we can get to a refocus that doesn't overlay the red versus blue divide.
Well, let me just start by saying thank you for the kind invitation, for being as part of this important forum, and for the good work going on here. You know, from the congressional Republican perspective, when I speak to my colleagues about college sports reform, a lot of them have an initial, and some of the more important members, an initial, statement. Look, we can't have unionization. And personally, I'm agnostic on unionization. The goal I'm trying to achieve is more opportunities on college campuses for America's sons and daughters to compete. And if that's, I think, the goal that we're trying to achieve, I think there's a series of policy prescriptions that fall out from that to make it sustainable and competitive. But I remind my colleagues that while I'm very free market when it comes to the private sector, college athletics is not the free market. It's a highly subsidized public good, and in my view should be regulated as such for the common good and for that goal of creating more opportunities on college sports, not less. And I guess the other concern, and then I also remind my colleagues that Congress allows professional sports leagues to do a number of things that are anti-competitive, and that all the pro sports leagues that we enjoy also have unions. So they in themselves have not been a detriment to what we enjoy about professional sports. So that, in terms of the common exceptions, might be too. But I think it's important, again, to start with the framing of the issue and what actually is the public policy outcome and goal that you would like members of Congress to try to adjudicate for. Because right now, there is not a consensus, I think, on that overall goal.
This is like testifying before Congress. You got to remember to hit the button. So if I didn't do that correctly, you'll remind me. I just want to jump in. I really appreciate you starting with the idea of common misconceptions, because what is happening right now is a policy conversation, to state the obvious. But I think we often don't realize that it's a policy conversation that has really been dominated for so many decades by one part of the policy equation, or one actor, and that's really the NCAA and men's revenue sport interests. So even our terminology, even the way we see this conversation, we don't realize how much it's structured around terms like student athlete, which was made up in the 1950s to deny college athletes their legal rights. Amateurism, which we know, scholars know, and the Supreme Court knows, and lots of courts have recounted, is something with a slippery definition that's really never been a fixed thing. It's been about denying labor rights to athletes. So there's so many misconceptions out there. I think we need to have a good understanding that we are in a policy conversation, and in order to do that right, we need to really ask ourselves, what are the kind of foundational principles of this conversation? And I would end that by saying, Kelsey, one of the greatest misconceptions I think that is out there currently is that change to college sports, if Congress doesn't intervene and give the NCAA or men's revenue sports interests what they're asking for, that change to college sports will doom the entire enterprise. And I'm here to tell you that I've published book chapters documenting every time a sports sponsor has made that claim. And that claim is made frequently, and we see it today with college sports. We need to save college sports. College sports is being destroyed. Well, I can tell you briefly, I won't take you through my entire book chapter, but this is what Major League Baseball said about free agency, right? This is what college sports interests said about Title IX. If we give spots to women, it's going to destroy the whole thing. This is what Olympic organizers said about allowing professionals to participate in the Olympic Games. And several dream teams later, here we are, still having Olympic Games. So the misconceptions are, let's not be afraid of change. And I think Congressman Baumgartner and Michele, I think you really say it best, which is we have some great minds, policy minds in the United States, and we can make things up better, and let's not be afraid to do that.
Awesome. Thank you, Dionne. And just to continue on that, I'll stay with you, Dionne. As we look at a law and policy perspective, as you've touched on, we keep hearing this term amateurism. We can put quotes around it. But in the context of sports, as it relates to amateurism, how has it been applied to college sports that you've seen? And are we really redefining amateurism by contemplating this collective bargaining right now that we're talking about in collegiate sports?
Yeah, so amateurism really hasn't been applied consistently. First of all, amateurism, let's get away from the idea that amateurism, again, is a fixed thing, right? It's historically been a model where there's this loose kind of idea that we deny athletes any form of benefit or compensation, and they're supposed to engage in sports just for the love of it and the good of it. And really what we know is that any rule that has been invoked in the name of amateurism has been done so just to deny athletes the benefits of their labor, right? So it's not like there's some God-given thing where if we're not doing sports under some amateurism label, the whole thing's going to fall apart. The Supreme Court, I think, did a nice job of dismantling that in the Alston case. So we're really not redefining amateurism so much as surfacing and having conversations that we've long needed to have in college sports. And really all collective bargaining or unionization is it's a source of countervailing power. And countervailing power is a very old idea in economics where, when you have sort of capitalism generating the way it does, a source of countervailing power can actually provide a great deal of stability. And of course, Michele knows this better than anybody, that in professional sports, unionization or countervailing power through unionization has provided a great deal of sustainability. So we're not really redefining or sort of ruining amateurism as much as we are having that fuller conversation about how can we bring that countervailing power voice into the equation.
And Congressman, you introduced H.R. 2663, which was alluded to in your introduction, the Restore College Sports Act, for those unfamiliar. And it was as a response to the instability and imbalance that followed House versus NCAA. So from your perspective, what did that case expose most clearly about the current system that we're witnessing? And what core principle did your legislation aim to restore first? Competitive balance, athlete fairness, institutional sustainability, or national order?
Well, thank you. I look at the college sports landscape, and what I'm particularly worried about is in the competitive pressure for big-time college football and college basketball that has such a disproportionate role on college campuses, that arms race will lead to reductions in sporting activities and other sports. And of course, we have college sports is a complex system, but college football is where the money is. women, to a great extent, have some Title IX protections, but we have seen in places like Washington State University, where we not only went through the breakup of the traditional Pac-12, but more recently, we've seen the competitive pressures lead to the loss of a very successful field program, for the track and field program, because of these competitive pressures. So I look at the arms race in big-time college football, and the coach's salaries arms race, and there's a lot of money there. And then I look at the reductions across the system, again, in something that's not the free market, that is a highly subsidized public good that the taxpayers have a lot of stake in. And to me, it looks like we need to cap the arms race, and I think you can get similar levels of utilities for fans and others. And then we need to make sure that the system stays public, isn't sold off to private equity, and essentially stops this slide towards what I see towards an NFL 2, where the 30 richest programs would recreate the NFL. Don't have anything against the NFL, but we only need one, and that's different than the traditional model. So what all of my legislation seeks to get to that goal of how do you get more sports for America's sons and daughters on college campuses. And I think when you have that as a goal and you look at the system, then you need to look at things like capping the arms race, sharing revenue, and across the system. So that's how it integrates. That has very much ran up against one of the other big efforts in Congress is the SCORE Act, which has a different view. The SCORE Act, seeks to ratify the House settlement. I think the House settlement is insufficient because it doesn't deal with Title IX realities, and we're already seeing its efforts to create competitive balance with so-called salary caps and other things sort of break apart. And then the final thing so it's all the above, is that I just think the NCAA is a weak and flawed institution, and in the minds of the American public, it would be better politically to sweep that institution away, create a new, what I call the College Sports Authority, that would be ratified by Congress and the President, and actually take its place where it should be in the public taxpayers' consciousness and understanding that this is a public sport and a publicly regulated entity. So, that's our approach. I'd be lying to you to say if it has been extremely successful so far, because of and I apologize for taking a bit of time, but just grant me just one more comment. As I came to Congress, I'm probably one of the few members of Congress that actually campaigned on this issue in my election, and I did well on it. President Trump won my district by 8%. I won my district by 21%, performed above the Trump baseline because I could get moderates and even some Democrats that cared about this issue. And so I've said there's some political ability there. But what I have found since I came to Congress is that the Big Ten and the SEC have some very highly paid lobbyists. And we got a lot of members from the South that care about, their parochial interests, which is okay. Everybody represents their members. So I was really hoping that with the president, I still think there's some chance in the good work of Cody Campbell and some others that this can be raised to a higher level and have a more national level, because I think if it just goes through the Big Ten and the SEC, that we won't get to a sustainable outcome. So that's what we're trying to do.
No, thank you for explaining that. And just a follow-up, as you talked about the public part, can a system remain publicly supported while operating more and more like a private commercial enterprise, Congressman?
Well, I have a lot of concern about the private equity sales of college athletics, and I think the public does too. That's something that Senator Cantwell and I have some shared concerns on. And, all these issues, in the fan experience, so what are we trying to accomplish? I spent a lot of time, I was very close friends with former Washington State University football coach Mike Leach. He and I taught a class together called Insurgent Warfare and Football Strategy, but I used to spend a lot of time with Mike, and, it's a relative competitive balance. So, college athletes had good experiences on campus, and fans had good experiences, when there weren't roller coasters and merry-go-rounds in locker rooms, and when football coaches made $200,000 a year instead of $12 million a year. So while I understand the competitive aspects and then the pressures on there to reward these things, I think from a basic public good and why it should be governed as a public good, we should look at the fact, and one of the things I put a salary, so I have a salary cap level at essentially 10 times the cost of student attendance, but our top 4-star generals in America make about $225,000 a year, and we don't pay them. They're pretty talented guys, but that's the profession they've chosen, and at least for a long in football coaches' salaries or athletic coaches' salaries, you could create good opportunities with good compensation, but more opportunities for people to enter the coaching profession and still maintain things like competitive fan enjoyment, competitive balance, and create more opportunities. So that's the public policy interest for doing things that are not market-based. And I say that as a free market Republican when it comes to the private sector.
Awesome. Thank you, Congressman. And Frank, I want to bring you in as we talk about policy. So Frank, you've worked at the intersection of sports business, governance, and labor structure. When you look at the current politics around unionization, which again have been heavily in the news, what do you think the people writing policy are still missing?
I think that, as we said in the sort of opening statements, we're missing sort of a core purpose in what we're trying to do. The congressman articulates a good core purpose here. Participation opportunities, maximize it for kids who want to go to college, compete in sports. And how do you do that? Despite being a Democrat by heritage and orientation, I am less regulatory than the congressman in some respects. I think that if we can figure out a way to create the right incentives on a baseline set of issues and then allow 1,000 flowers to bloom, allow, as someone said this morning, and I know I agree with you on the student athlete terminology, but someone said, in Conference 1, they're student athletes. In Conference 2, they're athlete students. And allow value propositions to be defined for rising athletes to choose from, I think we'll be way better off. And that's going to take some creativity, but it's going to take figuring out the first step in order to have a constructive conversation instead of listening to the Big Ten and the SEC say this is the death of our model.
Awesome. Thank you, Frank. And you talked about the student athlete panel earlier. And as I look into this audience, I'm still seeing some student athletes with us, or collegiate athletes, as Dionne has pointed out that we should be calling them. And I want everybody to remember that as we move forward, because language does matter, especially as we try to advance this issue. But Michele, I want to bring you on to talk about what is one thing that college athlete advocates or athlete advocates need to understand about power, their own power, before they can successfully build a labor movement from your own experience.
They have to even appreciate apologize. I missed a great deal of the first panel with the student athletes. I did catch some of it, and I didn't start openly weeping, but listening to them talking about being retaliated against, hearing someone mention that this notion of I'm a college athlete in one school, but a student, right? I mean, and then I heard someone say, well, all of that depends upon the good faith of the institution and hopefully the good faith of Congress. And I was sitting there thinking to myself, why can't it also depend upon the issues and interests of the students? That only happens if the students have a voice in the conditions of their being college athletes. And so when I speak, and I don't speak to a lot of college athletes, but when I do, I'm amazed at how hopeless and helpless they appear to be because they don't have a voice. They don't. I know there's been a tremendous amount of lobbying on the Hill, and I've actually seen some of the hearings, and they are predominated by representatives of the NCAA. There'll be some, and I'll use the word, token students that are there, but what should behoove the congressmen and the senators when they finally get around to just doing this seriously is starting out by having hearings that look just like that first panel. Just like that first panel, with just students talking about what they're going through. And so the good news is, and I know we're talking about policy, I'm talking about the fact that with the exception of college athletes, almost every other working American has the right to organize, meaning they have the right to organize and mobilize and use that leverage in conversations with their employer, except student athletes, except college athletes, don't hit me. So what I tell people is, think about it. Having said that, they should have these same young people should have the right to be in the room and use their leverage to dictate some of the terms and conditions of their lives academically as well. And I don't see any reason why a professional should have a right that a college athlete doesn't have. Last point I'll make, I was shocked at how much revenue was generated by college sports. I really honestly had no clue how much money was being made. And it's very difficult for me, that's why I apologize to those of you who live in the academic world, it's very difficult for me not to view this in large part as it is.
Awesome. Anybody want to add in to what Michele said? All right. So as we talk about, again, the collegiate athletes, as we look at them moving forward in this issue or matter, which bargaining issues would matter most for college athletes right now? Would it be compensation? Is it health, workload, due process, or would it be long-term care? And this is for any panelist to answer.
I think they told us a lot about that this morning, yes? Right? I mean, the money, not all of these young people are going to make a lot of money unless and until they get to the pros. You know, your NIL may be worth $1 million or it may be worth $5. But they all have to play. They all have to get on buses. They all have to practice. They all have to figure out a way to manage their academic responsibilities with their practice responsibilities. They all have to worry about their health. So I would imagine, if I was doing a CBA for some group of students, that much of the conversation, with the exception of that cap, and we can talk about that later, would not relate to issues involving revenue split, but any number of other issues that they have to deal with.
Well, let me just jump in there, just add something else to the list just for you to think about. I would argue that the most important thing for students to think about if they were to unionize would be opportunity. Because remember, in pro sports, you have a set number of jobs and you have revenue sharing. The college sports landscape is such that football is disproportionate because of fan interest, and then you have Title IX with some evolving legal prescriptions, but then you have a lot of pressures that are going to cascade down and have less opportunities. So, you know, as student athletes, do you want to maximize how much money Shedeur Sanders can make? Or do you want to maximize how many opportunities there are for students across all levels of college athletics? And I think the greater public good is in maximizing opportunities to compete. Michele, one thing, you don't know this, but when I was a state senator and I was chair of the Commerce and Labor Committee of the Washington State Senate, unusually Republicans had control of the state Senate when I was in the Washington State Legislature. That went away after I left, but I made it the Commerce, Labor, and Sports Committee, and I went to New York, and because we were interested in having the Sonics come back to Seattle. All the other elected officials used to try to meet with the NBA. I wanted to meet with the Players Association, so actually I met with one of your assistants. I think she was a very, very talented person who had been an attorney, I think, for Walmart that worked for you. And then, so
Erica.
I went to your headquarters when you had moved from Manhattan.
Yeah.
And but my point was,
you should have said hello.
but the reason I just raised this point was I wanted to talk to the Players Association because I thought rather than talking to the league about the same size pie and cutting it up, I wanted to talk, the players had an incentive to make the pie bigger. They should have the incentive to more opportunities, that you would want more opportunities to compete. So just be very aware of that if you do get into collective bargaining as students, that you don't just try to maximize payments and welfare, but you think about this opportunity given the realities of the competitive pressures.
Thank you, Congressman. And just to follow up on that for you, Michele, from your perspective, is the professional sports union model difficult to apply to collegiate athletics?
The reason I don't think it is, the two reasons why I don't think it is. One, the same interest that, in many ways, there's obviously some differences, but the same interest that pros have, the college athletes have. So again, the CBA discussion would not be too terribly different from the CBA discussions at the professional level. And the second thing is, and this drives me nuts, at many universities, and many of the same universities and colleges where athletes cannot organize, the students that work in the cafeteria, the students that work in the power plant, they're allowed to organize. So students appreciate the power and leverage that they can, I think many times they can, appreciate the power and leverage they have if they're able to organize. They just need permission and not have you guys give the NCAA an exemption. And Congressman, I agree with you. There are so many things that Congress could do to stop some of the nonsense that's happening right now on the college level. Just let the students have the right to organize. That's all I ask, so that they can be a part of that conversation. And whatever, no, I'm about to get on my, well, I am on my soapbox, so let me step down.
Can I just add, in terms of the interests that are being served, the House settlement is set up in a way that doesn't reward anyone except the stars. They're the ones who have the bidding wars going on. And it is set up as Jeff Kessler's ideal labor system, which is annual free agency, no solid cap, unlimited amounts of cash that can be bid, and nothing long-term. So the star athlete can pocket a lot of money in year one, play, and then move on, do the same thing a second year. There's no incentive baked in to have any stability in either the roster management and the other stuff that contributes to quality of sports, or more importantly for the kids, education. And I'm not going to presume to speak for the student athletes. They need to speak for themselves, but I would ask them to think about that as they articulate positions, formulate positions, and think about what they want to do. Who's going to be served if you do organize and bargain? Is it going to be the interests of the superstars, or is it going to be the interests of athletes as a whole, including going down to new participation opportunities?
It's interesting, in the last year and a half in Congress, as this issue's kind of ebbed and flowed right front. I think precisely because of this reason, the Congressional Black Caucus, which you may not know this, I'm not a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, but they will have a really important role in that discussion, precisely because that area, the House settlement, which SCORE Act really has ratified, it is set up to maximize return for Livy Doon and Arch Manning and Shedeur Sanders, but there are a whole lot of people benefiting from college sports at different levels. And so, what I tell my colleagues when they say, if you knew what the unions thought about me in Washington State, you'd be surprised I'm on this panel. But again, this is not a free market. This is a highly subsidized public good, should be regulated as such. And I tell my friends, LeBron James is worth more to the NBA than he is compensated by the Los Angeles Lakers. But there's a system that says it's worth taking some of LeBron James' value to the NBA and redistributing that across the system for the good of competitive balance and what they have to do. And I've talked to a lot of conference commissioners over the last year and a half. One of the most interesting conference commissioners I talked to was Stu Jackson, who of the WCC, who spent a lot of time with the NBA. In our conversation, he pointed out that in last year's NBA championship, it was Oklahoma City versus Indiana, two of the smallest markets in the NBA, and he thought that was good, for the NBA. So if you have a lot of people making the force of policy for Alabama and Notre Dame and Ohio State and Oregon, you're missing a big piece of what makes college sports special. But for you as student athletes and you as union advocates, there really is, and I'm saying this is Republican, but on the Democrat side of the ledger, you have your athletes advocates, the players agents, but also the welfare, and I put the Congressional Black Caucus group there. They're thinking through about what actually, and that will, if it comes together to be solved, that perspective of African American lawmakers will really, really be important if Congress is going to do something, and they realize. So there's a lot of good conversations going on with them.
And let me just add that during CBA negotiations that I was involved in, we made it our business to make sure we were protecting what we refer to as the middle class, because LeBron's going to be all right, right? I don't have to worry about LeBron going broke, but I had 450 other guys, or 425 other guys, that don't have the kind of financial or commercial value that someone like LeBron has. And that's what happens when you have a union. You have an organization that's there to protect the entire membership. And the problem with House that I had, I agree, it did a great job of making sure that the highest or the most celebrated performers were going to get paid well, but didn't say a whole lot about the person that's probably never going to see a pro game in his life unless he buys a ticket. So.
Going from LeBron, who has obviously had a very lengthy career, to collegiate athletes that have time limits on their time in college sports, how do athletes get out there to be incentivized to actually be part or start unions? I'll start with you, Frank, and then anybody else that wants to answer. Or maybe not, Frank. Anybody can answer.
That is the biggest question that I have. And remember, I'm coming at this not from a union perspective, but from the management perspective. It was tough enough at the NFLPA when, at the time I was working there, working at the NFL, the average career was 4.5 years. Which is roughly what the career of a college athlete is going to be. But those people who are members of the NFLPA are all doing the same job, different positions, same job, which is playing for that Lombardi on an annual basis. So there is a coherent set of objectives that they're trying to serve by bargaining collectively. There's so many different objectives in college sports that it's difficult to take that first step to developing a class consciousness, to use Marxist perspective, but to just understanding what are you trying to achieve. And once you understand that, then you can move on from there. But I don't know how to get that understanding going, and I wish I could figure out, because I think that sports on the management side is only as strong as the union on the other side, because if it's done right, it's a partnership.
I would say, Kelsey, just to add that it's really hard to get athletes to understand that they have power. And when I co-chaired the Commission on the State of U.S. Olympics and Paralympics, our Olympians and Paralympians and people in the pipeline consistently told us, we are absolutely terrified. We are terrified some coach, somebody's going to kick us off a team. They have been conditioned to not speak in favor of their rights and their needs. And so I think it's a particular set of problems, but I think if you look at history, you see that the outcomes can be really terrific. And I think there's a case to be made to athletes. So look at what the U.S. women's national soccer team team did when they organized, and ultimately it ended up in a landmark piece of legislation that Senator Cantwell spearheaded, bipartisan piece of legislation, the Equal Pay for Team USA Act. We know the U.S. women's hockey team has taken a stand, so there are lots of examples. Curt Flood in Major League Baseball. If you like free agency, go thank Curt Flood. So there are so many ways where athletes have realized what their power is. They speak out, and again, I want to just repeat this because it's so much part of our conversation. It never destroys sports. It only makes sports more valuable and lucrative and fair and inclusive. So I hope we can make that case to athletes and to policymakers.
You know, if I could get a piece of legislation passed, or if I could get one piece of advice to the college athletes, I'd love to pass legislation on college. Just say that all college athletes are equal, have equal value, and that will share in the revenue and the NIL payments across the system. And if you did that, you would ensure more sporting opportunities. Now, you know, in my model, the left tackle at LSU isn't making an NFL type salary. But I think about, again, what are we trying to govern for, and where's the appropriate place for college sports as a public good in the American landscape? Well, I think if you think of the continuum of high school elementary sports, high school sports, college sports, pro sports, that there's a defined space there that is not the same thing as pro sports, but it's also not high school. But you know, the American public, you know, I find as somebody that one of the great things about being a member of Congress is you get to reapply for your job every 2 years, and so you get constant feedback from your bosses, and so you have to think about how you communicate on these issues. I think, you know, big definitive underlined statements. You know, why as a public good, why do we subsidize public sports on college campuses? Well, for young people, they get a lot of benefit from that, and particularly, we've seen it's been very, very important for young females to have college athletics. But look at the situation of males on college athletics campuses. We have less males going to college than we do females. And they both need opportunities for sports, but is that public good? And that's the danger of what's happened with House and SCORE. There's a lot of dangers of it, but the competitive pressures of football and the slide towards NFL 2, combined with the protections of Title IX for the ladies, it is male sports and male Olympic sports that are the most exposed in the competitive landscape. So anyway, back to my just point on this, what should the student athletes, you know, do next? To me, it's a definitive, what are you organizing around if you're going to organize? Well, what is your value proposition for what you want to do? And I would say all athletes are equal, all sports are equal, and if you started with that premise and treated each other as such, that you would get to a better outcome than what we have right now, which is no unlimited free agency with no salary caps. And if you're Shedeur Sanders or the starting left tackle at LSU, you're going to do really well in that system, but it's going to end up costing somebody in another college program their opportunity to compete.
And Congressman, as you talk about costing somebody, so if taxpayers help to sustain collegiate sports, what does the system owe them in return? Also, what does the system owe to athletes, to students, and the general public at large?
Well, again, you know, in my philosophy, why are we doing any of this? Why is any of this worth being subsidized by the public? Because it has a societal and educational component somewhere in between high school sports, you know, and the pros. So I do think we have to do something that returns the academic purpose to more forcefully to college, to the landscape, and I think that's why, you know, we subsidize it. But you know, there are other aspects as well too that we get out of it. You know, for America is so politically divided right now in many respects. School and college sports is one of the few places where people that are hyper political don't wear a Republican jersey or a Democratic jersey. So there's a real societal cohesion piece there. Anybody that spent time in a locker room knows what it does for racial integration to have common good and those things that are important, for our society. But I do worry a lot about in the unfettered jungle of free agency and no salary caps, how far back the academic purpose is there too, because we got to make sure that for the good of society. And it's good for the students as well too, but I don't look as, I've never approached this issue as the student athletes as victims in the system. I look at it, my modality is I'm asking people to subsidize this, and so what do the taxpayers want out of this system? But the taxpayers want you to get educated. You're a lot better off for society if you're educated than if not.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that? And so again, I want to make sure that we have takeaways for this. And so as we look at this issue, how do we get started on making unionization practical in today's collegiate landscape space? What stakeholders are needed and what needs need to be accomplished to make this a reality? And what role, if any, do any of you on the stage plan to play in this issue?
Start staring at me. There are, and I'm not going to call any names, but there are efforts right now by people, any number, some of them sketchy, but who are out there talking to student athletes about what's happening. I mean, many of them did not know a thing about the House settlement until it happened. Right? So that there are people of goodwill and people that have some experience in organizing. They're out there in the trenches talking. I had an incredibly interesting conversation with someone a couple of days ago, and I was happy that he was reporting back that the students were really receptive to knowing that there was a way for them. And they weren't talking about money. They were talking about, again, I need to be able to pass my history exam, but I can't do that and be on the swim team if I have to practice 17 hours a day. So it's happening. People, like any organizing in any industry, it has to begin with people who care about this and know about this stuff, being in the trenches, talking to the affected members or potential members, and getting the ball rolling. And the second thing that has to happen is the resistance has to be confronted. I mean, one of the things that I delight in hearing is when I do hear ADs or coaches say, I don't see the inherent evil in giving students the right to organize. I'd like to have them be at the table as well. So it's not going to happen on Tuesday. It's going to take some time. But the good news is I think that the beginnings of organizing students is happening. We just don't want the politicians to give the NCAA their out right now by giving them that exemption. And the last thing I'll say is, and this is a different administration, but the NLRB and DOJ both weighed in on the House settlement and both pointed out that there were some antitrust problems with anything that suggested that students not be allowed to organize. And so I make that point because, again, I understand we're talking about policy, but we're also talking about federal law. And exempting one entity from having to comply with federal law. And as lawyers, right, Frank, we don't like hearing about people being able to violate the law. Well, maybe we
do not like that at all. And specifically, there's one thing that I would note, and this relates to a point in the congressman's legislation about replacing, I believe you described it as a weak and flawed institution. There's two sections that are baked into the SCORE Act that when I first read it just really, really bothered me. And essentially what they would do is they would set up the Power 2 by virtue of supermajority voting as arbiters of who can be a member of the NCAA and give them a right to expel schools from membership. When you think that through from a business perspective, what that essentially is the Power 2 sort of trying to glom onto that 120-odd years of NCAA intellectual property, that these are collegiate athletes, these are champions, and shove everybody else out the door. Kessler at one point said, nobody cares about Lehigh. Well, I disagree. I think Lehigh is as important as Ohio State. They may play a different role, but you need to set up a system that doesn't treat the only ones who count in college sports as those athletes who go to the 69 P4 schools, but that takes account of all of the people. As Cody Campbell said in his presentation, this is the second greatest educational opportunity program in American history behind the GI Bill, and that's why I think the congressman is particularly concerned about this. And you need to make sure that whatever happens here, you don't set up an unassailable power center, but you set up a bunch of people who can bargain, compromise, et cetera, and get to a solution that's good for athletes, schools, conferences, and the country.
I just want to add to that in terms of asking what voices we need to get to the table, and I really appreciate that the congressman is thinking more broadly about, and again, changing the discourse from the usual talking points. Obviously, athletes need to have the primary seat at the table, but what I like about what the congressman is saying about youth sport, about opportunities, is it dials into our youth sports system. We have a youth sports system that is got a lot of problems. But one of the problems is that you have millions and millions and millions of children who are being told to get involved in youth sport because it's great for you, and then we have a hard stop at college because our warped system has decreased the opportunities that are available. And I like that and I appreciate that the congressman is articulating that. So youth sport parents and kids, let's talk to people who work in the youth sports space to see how intercollegiate sports fits in. Faculty and educational leaders. Maybe I'm just saying this because I'm a professor, but guess what? We're supposed to have a role in our educational institutions. And one of the things I've been so lucky about is I can speak freely about sports because I don't work on a campus with intercollegiate sports teams where people say, hey, the athletic department kind of rules the roost here. So you have faculty, you have educational leaders, you have taxpayers, you have a whole youth sport ecosystem, and of course you have athletes. There are so many people to be talking to, and so when we talk about policy, let's see how we get all these voices into the conversation.
I think the premise of the Big Ten is so absurd as a nationwide athletic conference that anybody, if you're somebody that thinks a volleyball player should get on a plane in the middle of the week to travel from Eugene, Oregon to play a volleyball game at Rutgers in New Jersey, then you are so far from what college athletics should be for any semblance of academic purposes that you shouldn't even be in the room for the discussion. You know, I said in most people that, outside of people that care a lot about college athletics, most people think transcontinental athletic conferences are absolutely, ridiculous. They don't make any sense. So if I was involved with the players, because I said I don't look at the players as victims, I look at what return want for the taxpayers, but one of the places those line up, I really do think the players are victims when it comes to these absurd travel demands during the academic school year. Actually, in my bill, it says during the academic school, I mean, I'm very prescriptive, but to try to illustrate the point, during the academic school year, you shouldn't be traveling more than 2 time zones away, and they should go back to regional conferences if you want to do things naturally. So that would be a place that I think the players could start because it illustrates it with the public and it talks about the academic purpose, that the idea that we're asking college students to travel across a continent in the middle of school year. I mean, that's so absurd. The private equity piece, again, the public is not into private equity. There's a place there where the players could really lean in on as well too. But again, hopefully they'll do it to maximize opportunity across the system. And I think just differentiating yourselves, and finally, I'll just close on saying this, is that there is so much more money in college athletics than there has ever been, and there are less opportunities for America's sons and daughters to compete on college campuses and all the ancillary things that go with them. So this is a solvable problem. You know, the money is there. What we need between players and all of us that care about college athletics, we need to create a system of governance that can control the competitive pressures and the incentives, because the athletic directors can't do it, the presidents can't do it. You know, this thing is getting run primarily by 2 conference commissioners and some TV executives in a back room shoving this thing towards NFL 2, and they don't care if it means that there's less opportunities in a lot of these places. So, anyway, that was where I would start, is stop getting on the plane to go across the country for these stupid games while you should be doing your chemistry homework.
Thank you, Congressman, and I'm sure a lot of the athletes that have had to do that would agree with you. As we begin to close out, one other thing that we've seen in the news is the nonprofit status of NCAA athletic departments starting to raise some questions. And so we know most private universities operate as a 501c3 organization under the tax code. Does an athletic department operating with a nonprofit status have any impact on this unionization debate?
I'm turning back to you guys. I told you I don't know anything about college. I don't know the answer to that.
Answer is, in my mind, no.
No, that's...
I mean,
yeah.
501c3, we were a 501c4 until recently at the NFL. And it's just, it's a fancy pass-through partnership there. 501c3, the basic advantage that you get out of it is donations are tax deductible. You may want to hive off donations for certain purposes being tax deductible, but that's a rifle shot, it's not a shotgun.
That would have been my guess.
And if full unionization was not yet realistic, what forms of athlete representation could still be most meaningful for the athletes out here?
Yeah, it's tough because I don't want there to be an assumption that I think that there really is a substitute, because I don't. But to the extent, and I think there is, we can all probably agree that there's going to be some change in the governing structure of college athletes. The NCAA may survive, but I don't think it's going to necessarily survive in its current form. But to the extent there's some new entity that comes into fruition, at the very minimum, there should be equal representation between this whatever school, whatever that employer is, and students. There can't, again, be this sort of token representation of 1 or 2 students that have a vote or a voice. At a minimum, there needs to be equal representation so that there's some real leverage that the students can exercise. But again, I'm not suggesting that that would be an adequate substitute.
You know, I think that, you know, unionization is a means to an end. Again, I'm agnostic on unionization. We have public policy goals that we want to achieve. What's the best way to achieve those goals? I think those folks that want those public policy goals should think about, you know, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, does it necessarily mean what you name the duck? Because politically, it would be a real reach for Republicans because of some of union issues, like with SEIU and service workers and other things in other areas. That would be a really big leap for Republicans to take in name, and some of those union organizing groups will want to do that. But I would just think, again, it's a means to an end. Walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. What's the compromise that you can do? And particularly with the Congressional Black Caucus in our Congress, I think that's probably where the compromise solution will come from if there's legislation passed.
And Kelsey, can I just add, I mean, I just want to follow on with that. I think we get tripped up every time we talk about any type of athletes' rights proposition by saying it's just too hard, we can't figure it out. And I want to go back to how Michele started us off by saying, yeah, we can figure it out. An entity needs, and I agree with the congressman, don't have to call it a union. Union's just a label we have with our New Deal, era legislation that we're talking about here. It needs power. It needs real independence, and it needs to have a fiduciary obligation toward the athletes to represent them. What we know does not work and what we should not see in the college sports space is what has happened in the Olympic and Paralympic movement space. We have an athletes commission, right, that's not really independent, and they're good folks there trying to do really good work. But what my congressional commission found when we looked at this is that they were never able to be a real voice for athletes because they weren't independent, they didn't have the power, and there was no obligation when they got leaned on by the USOPC to really speak for all athletes. So Congress can, in fact, solve this problem, endow any kind of entity with the power to do the things that a union does and talk about and bargain with the things that a union would do.
Awesome. Well, a round of applause for our panelists again on this conversation around unionization. Thank you all so much. We appreciate your time, and of course, stay tuned for our next panel.